at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard in Vallejo, California, in March 1941. The welding torch went out and on. In the dim light of the submarine building bay, Edward Nelson, a welder who made $11 a day, scrolled through a worn-out notebook full of anger. There must be a greater way. This is crazy. My Navy bosses keep telling me to work faster, but they wouldn't listen to my idea. Through the tangle of, there are scaffoldings under the wooden deck of a submarine that is still being built. His eyes had just seen something that makes your blood boil. 12 workers worked all shift long to put down just one piece of deck planking. Very large. The spaces inside the sections below each wooden deck were filled with scaffolding. Strong men with wrenches working in squished areas, twisting nuts onto bolts that went through from above. It took hours and hours of work just to attach wooden boards to steel frames. The old way required accuracy, care, and a lot of valuable time. That time, there were dark clouds over the Pacific that America did not have. But herein, there were the same ways to connect ships at what would soon be one of the busiest shipyards in the world. It had been for decades. Theodore Edward Nelson, born in California and 36 years old. He had learned a lot about mechanics the hard way. I worked in machine shops all over California for 15 years. Learned for 15 years. He knew how metal worked, how electricity moved, and how to solve problems if only someone would pay attention. What the Navy bosses didn't know was that this angry welder had already found a solution. What Nelson didn't do. But he didn't know that his simple answer had been turned down by his bosses. Would soon save the U.S. Navy more than 50 million man-hours and completely change how ships are built. Always. Weeks before, the change began in the crowded areas below decks, where the real war was happening. Every day, people fought against waste. It was March 15, 1941. Mare Island Naval Shipyard opened 8 months and 22 days before Pearl Harbor. It took place on 635 acres along the Napa River in Vallejo, California, 25 miles away, not far from San Francisco. Set up by Commander David Glasgow in 1854. Farragut, it was the first base for the U.S. Navy to be built on the Pacific Ocean. Mare Island had by early 1941 grown into the best place on the West Coast to build submarines. The yard was open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There are 3 shifts of workers. The building of submarines had sped up sharply as tensions with Japan rose. The yard had about 12,000 civilian workers in early 1941, and that number would grow too. By 1944, there were almost 50,000. Ted worked with those 12,000 people. Nelson, you are worker number 3872. He worked the whole day and made $11. Shift from 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. His job was to weld, mainly on submarine hulls and features inside them. He worked quickly and accurately and was good at what he did, but more and more, he was angry at what he saw as needless inefficiency. Each place he looked, the problem was there. Wooden deck boards, put in place on aircraft carriers, cruisers, and submarines. The Navy, chosen wooden decks for more than one reason. Wood was easier to walk on than steel when it was wet. Moving around in wood was silent. The wood helped keep the cold steel below from freezing, and in the event of a fire, it would be easier to fix or replace wooden decks than welded steel plates. But the way it was installed was old-fashioned, hard to do, and terribly slow. The usual process stayed the same, going through a lot of difficult steps since the First World War. First, at exact distances, workers would drill holes through the wooden planks. These holes are sunk so that the heads of the bolts can sit flush with the deck surface. After that, workers would place the boards on the steel frame of the deck. After that came the nightmare. In the submarine or ship cabins, workers had to build a lot of scaffolding under the deck. To get to the bottom of the steel deck framework, workers needed more than one level of supports. Once the platform was set up, workers on top and below would work together to put long threaded bolts through the frame, through the wooden boards, and into the steel frame through holes that are the same size. People working below, standing on. People working on staging platforms in small, dark areas would thread nuts onto the ends of the bolts that stuck out. They would get tighter. These nuts with wrenches, which pushed the wooden boards hard against the steel frame above. Last but not least, workers. Side would put wooden plugs in the counter's holes to make the deck surface smooth. The whole thing was done again. For each piece of wood. Some submarines have decks made of wood that are several hundred square feet in size, needing thousands of separate attachment places. The wooden flight deck on an aircraft carrier was over 100,000 square feet. The amount of work that had to be done was crazy. A standard installation on a submarine deck needed a group of 12 to 16 guys to work for 5 to 7 days. The structure by itself, it took 2 full days to build and another day to take apart. The real installation of the bolts used up the rest. Time. Ted Nelson had done this job many times before. He had spent a huge amount of. For hours, they stood on scaffolding platforms and threaded nuts onto bolts in underwater compartments that were only 4 feet high. His back hurt from bending over all the time. He had scars on his hands from wrenches that had slipped off. He had lost all patience. But his anger was caused by more than just personal pain. He could see what was going on. There was going to be war. Everyone at Mare Island knew it. It was already late for the yard to finish the submarine, and building up. The Navy needed boats to be in the water, not in dry dock, while decks were being put on. Every day of delay brought a fight one day closer. Nelson knew there was a better way to do things because America wasn't ready to fight. He had been thinking about the issue for months, going over it in his mind while working long hours as a welder. Do the work. He thought the answer was clear. Instead of coming down from above and instead of threading nuts from below, why not just weld the attachment pins to the steel frame? Only weld from one side, from above. There's no need for scaffolding, nuts and bolts, or people crammed in. There are no sections below, just quick, strong, permanent welds. The idea was easy to grasp. In a split second, a threaded stud, which is basically a bolt without a head, could be attached to the steel deck frame. To connect to these studs, wooden planks would have threaded plugs or special nuts. The entire process could be done only from the top side. There will be no work on platforms or below deck. Teams above and below need to work together. Nelson knew what stud welding was before, but only in a small way. It was possible to make a horizontal flat plate. Cutting. On a flat piece of steel, a small pile of flux powder would be put down. In the process, a stud would be put in place. The stud and the steel would be joined together by an electric spark. But this method only worked laying flat on the ground. The flux powder would just fall off in a straight line, or all places had to be welded on overhead surfaces in naval construction. All the way up, down, side to side, and overhead. This was the issue that had engineers who work with welding for 20 years. How to weld studs on non-H areas that are flat? He thought he knew the answer. He said it was so easy. He almost laughed when he thought of the answer. Put the flux in a small clay cap instead of loose flux powder. Connect the cap to the stud's end. The flow stays where it is no matter what. Right place. He drew a picture of his thought in his book. With a handheld welding gun, a spring-loaded device that presses the stud against the steel, and an electrical trigger that makes the weld. Arc, a one-time use clay flux cap on the end of every stud. Everything. It would only take 1 second per stud to do the job. In that time, one person could put up dozens of studs. It took to make a single bolted connection up to now. Taking his idea to his boss, a Navy lieutenant named Williamson. There wasn't much time for the meeting. Not much of a look at the drawing. We have set up processes, Mr. Nelson. We keep up with Navy. The details. If you'd rather weld than watch someone place bolts, stick to what you're currently assigned. Nelson tried again, this time talking to the shipyard's chief welding expert, who was a civilian worker. Hartwell. He talked about the time saved, the work cut, the getting rid of the costs of platforms. Hartwell was nicer than Morrison, but he was just as rude. Son, people, for 20 years, people much smarter than you and me have been trying to figure this out. If it were that simple, someone would do it. They already would have done it. In any case, the Navy has rules. We can't just change how things are done because a blacksmith has an idea. You need to get okay. In Washington, D.C., from the Bureau of Ships, you need to study engineering. You need to test the prototype. It takes years to do that. Nelson said, we don't have years. Now is the time for submarines. Hartwell just shrugged. I don't care about that, Mr. Nelson. The trouble I'm having is building boats that meet the rules. You're having trouble doing the welding work that you're paid to do. Nelson was upset and angry when he left the meeting. They were given away to save tens of thousands of hours on each submarine. They fired him for no good reason. Thought about Not because his idea was bad or wouldn't work, but only because he was a welder. Because changing how things were done needed papers and permissions. Because, since following the rules was more important than coming up with new ideas, he gave it one more shot by writing a official letter to Captain Thomas Withers, who is in charge of the shipyard. The message was well written and explained the present lack of efficiency, suggesting stud welding as a solution, estimating time, and saving money. Following the established process for worker, he sent the letter through the right channels. Some ideas. 3 weeks later, he got a letter, a form letter thanking him for wanting to make the port run more efficiently, a nice explanation that the Bureau of Ships Engineering Review Board looked at all of the technical ideas. A note that says a reasonable opinion that the review should be looked at had been sent for consideration. For most people, the process took 18 to 24 months. He would be told if his idea was accepted, given permission to study further. 18 to 24 months. The war might have already happened by then, be over or lost. Nelson squished the letter together and threw it away. He made a choice that night that would change his life and the history of the Navy. He would build it himself if the Navy wouldn't listen. He would show the idea worked. After that, they'd have to pay attention. He made room in the garage behind his small house in Valley. Emma, his wife, watched with worry as he started to gather trash, steel, and tools for welding. She told him, "Ted, you are going to get fired. I thought you were working. Work on Navy projects instead of your own ideas. This will help the Navy," he told her. They just do not know it yet. Nelson built his first prototype stud over the next few weeks, working nights and weekends. Gun for welding. The concept was rough, but it worked. A handle with a gun grip and a spring loaded. A plunger to hold and press the screw, an electrical trigger that is hooked up to a power source for welding, and a quick release. A way to load new pieces. The flux cap was the most important new idea. He tried out various ceramic materials, flux mixtures, and cap shapes. After a lot of through tests, he came up with a cap that could be made, kept the flux in place, and allow the arc to start properly. Cheaply. By May 1941, he had a prototype that worked. He put it to the test on old steel. In any pose you can think of, including horizontally, vertically, overhead, at heights. The gun did its job perfectly. You could weld a stud in less than 1 second. Traditional through bolts were not as strong as the weld, and most importantly, it didn't need any entry below the surface. He showed the prototype too. Worked and showed it to a few other welders during lunch. They were amazed and thrilled. Someone said, "This will save us so much time." Someone else said, "You should show this to Morrison." Theodore. He shook his head. It was already shown to Morrison. He wasn't interested. Then, give up your job and start your own business. Another welder said, "Sell your gun too. Across the country. You'll make a lot of money." The idea hadn't. Nelson had an idea. He worked as a blacksmith, not in business. He didn't have any money or manufacturing center, but I have never run a business before. But it made more sense the more he thought about it. If the Navy wouldn't use his idea, but private companies might. People were being hired at the Kaiser factories in Richmond. The Bethlehem Steel Shipyard in San Francisco was getting bigger. Along the West Coast, there were docks. There aren't enough workers, and there is a lot of work to be done. On June 20th, Ted Nelson gave his resignation to Mare Island Naval in 1941. Boathouse. His boss tried to talk him out of it. "Neil, you're a good person. Welder, don't quit a steady job to work on a crazy idea." This is Nelson's. "I made up my mind." He told Morrison, "I'm going to make welding guns. Whenever. I hope you remember this talk when the Navy comes back and wants to buy them." He left Mare Island with $11, a garage full of tools, and a confidence that his idea would work. The Nelson Specialty Welding Equipment Corporation was formed by him. On July 1st, 1941, the bank gave him $95,000. Reconstruction Finance Corporation, a government body set up during the Great Depression to help small businesses get loans. Online stores. With that money, he rented a small shop in Vallejo and started making things. Making tools for stud welding. The first few months were tough. He did not. Buyers, a good name, and a way to get their products to people. He called small machine shops and machine shops in his area to make sales. Fabrication companies showing off his gun and talking about how it would save time. Most people were not sure. Some people were interested enough to try out a unit that was being shown. The orders came in very slowly at first. To come in, he had sold 18 welding guns and a number of other items by September 1941, 1,000 studs with flux caps. Then, on December 7, 1941, everything changed. Pearl Harbor. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed by the Japanese attack. There are 188 planes, 3 cruisers, and 3 destroyers. 243. The Americans died. The U.S. was at war. All of a sudden, building ships wasn't just important. It was important for the country to stay alive. Within days of Pearl Harbor, the business of building ships began to grow, exploded into a lot of busy activity. A record number of Liberty ships were being built at once at the Kaiser shipyards. Mare Island Naval Shipyard got urgent orders to build submarines. Yards owned by Bethlehem Steel and others started working triple shifts. And every single one of these facilities faced the same problem: how to build ships fast enough. The traditional methods were too slow, too labor-intensive, too wasteful of precious time. Ted Nelson's phone began ringing. Shipyard purchasing agents who had dismissed his invention weeks earlier now wanted to place large orders. The Kaiser shipyards ordered 50 welding guns and 10,000 studs. Bethlehem Steel ordered 40 guns. Even Mare Island Naval Shipyard, where he had been rebuffed just months earlier, placed an order for 60 guns and 20,000 studs. Morrison, his former supervisor, handled the purchase requisition. There was no apology, no acknowledgement that Nelson had been right, just a tour official order and a request for prompt delivery. By January 1942, less than 1 month after Pearl Harbor, Nelson's small workshop could not keep up with demand. He was receiving orders faster than he could manufacture products. He needed a real factory, more workers, better equipment. He leased a larger facility in San Leandro, a few miles south of Oakland. The building sat in the middle of a cornfield, isolated and unimpressive, but it had space, power, and room for expansion. By March 1942, he employed 20 workers. By June, 50. By September, 150. The factory worked around the clock, 7 days a week. Welding guns rolled off the production line at a rate of 30 per day. Stud output reached thousands per day. Every big shipyard on the West Coast was now using Nelson's stud welding equipment, and the stories coming back were extraordinary. A submarine deck installation that previously needed 12 workers and 6 days could now be completed by 3 workers in 1 day. The elimination of scaffolding saved 2 extra days and freed workers for other jobs. The welds were stronger than standard bolted connections. The wooden deck planks could be removed and changed more easily for maintenance or repair. At the Mare Island Naval Shipyard, the building moved along very quickly. 17 submarines were finished at the yard between 1941 to 1945, with an average building time that steadily got smaller as new methods were used. Stud welding wasn't the only new idea, but it was a very important one. A piece of the puzzle for speed. By the middle of 1942, stud welding was not. It can be used for a lot of different things besides attaching to a deck. Hooks for pipes, supports for cables, mounts for tools, and bulkhead connections. Any situation. When an attachment needed to be made to a steel building quickly, stud welding was the best way to do it. The Navy Bureau of Ships, which had turned down Nelson's idea at first, now looked into his method in great detail. Teams of engineers looked at the strength, durability, and failure causes of the welds. Nelson had always known what the results showed. His welds were better than the old ways in more ways than one. They were stronger and more reliable than others. On November 19, 1942, after leaving his $11 a day welder job 11 months ago, Ted Nelson got a group of Navy officers is paying a formal call. They showed up at his plant in San Leandro without being asked. 5 guys in a group, in dress shirts. Captain Harrison, who worked for the Bureau of Ships, did the talking. "No, Mr. Nelson, we are here to let you know that the Navy has finished reviewing your stud welding process. What we found is that the U.S. Navy has saved about 5 million man-hours because of your idea on surface and submarine ships building for the past 10 months. It is expected that number to go up a lot as more factories adopt how your tech works." He took a break and then went on. "In the name of the Secretary of For your outstanding service to the Navy and the United States government, I am authorized to give you this award. Taking part in the war fight, Nelson was very shocked. His idea was turned down. They had not listened to his suggestions. He had to quit his job and put everything at risk to prove his idea. Now, he was being given a ticket. Nelson's face must have shown that he was upset. Captain Harrison, I get it. In early 1941, you sent a plan to Mare Island, Mr. Nelson. These. Looked over that file. At the time, your plan wasn't looked at carefully enough. It was a mistake, and I'm sorry on behalf of the Navy. However, your choice to build the getting technology on its own has led to faster rollout than would have been possible through the normal procurement process. There are times when the best thing you can do for your country is to skip the official routes and just solve the problem. Nelson took the award with mixed feelings. Pride in what he had done and satisfaction in his persistence, but as well as anger at the red tape that almost stopped this new idea from happening. The war went on. The needs for production went up. Nelson's business grew again by opening a second location. In March 1943, there was a factory in Camden, New Jersey. This plant on the East Coast grew supplies for ships in New York, Philadelphia, Norfolk, and Asheville. Nelson Specialty Welding Equipment Corporation was founded in the middle of 1943. Worked more than 400 people and brought in about $4 million a year. Ted Nelson still worked 16 hours a day in the workplace while wore tan pants and shirts to work. Still got a small salary of $1,000 per month. All the money made was put back into the business to pay off debts, buy more tools, and grow. But what he did for the war, it took a huge amount of work. The Navy says that 5 million man-hours have been saved by. Late 1942 was just the start. With the war going on, stud welding became. As this became normal practice for all naval construction, the time savings grew by a factor of 10. By 1943, it was not only used on submarines, but also on aircraft ships. There were battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and a lot of smaller ships. The Nelson stud welding was used to build Navy ships of the Essex class by Newport News Shipbuilding and other yards. A lot for attaching to the flight deck and parts inside. About 20,000 screws were needed for each carrier. As the war went on, the Navy built 24 Essex-class carriers. The battleships of the Iowa class used. Stud welding is used to connect armor, deck planking, and equipment mounts. The technology was used all over the Baltimore-class heavy cruisers, destroyer guards, landing ships, and patrols. Faster and stronger ways to connect were good for all types of naval ships, not just boats. But the most important effect was on building submarines. He had worked at Mare Island Naval Shipyard and, where his plan had been turned down, became one of the best at building submarines in the world. The yard made 17 submarines during the war, with building times getting faster and faster. Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire changed its name to completed 79 submarines between July and December, making it the best submarine maker. 1940 and July 1945. South Carolina's progress was based on. There were many advances, but stud welding was one of the most important ones. The yard widely adopted Nelson's method and used it not only for the decking, but also for the whole boats. The inside. Statistics on work showed what happened. South Carolina fired 3. On January 27, 1944, 2 boats at the same time. The Ronquil, the Redfish, and Razorback. A 4th submarine, called Scabberfish, was also launched on the same day. 7 subs in one day. That has never been done by another company, either before or since, when things were at their busiest. In 1944, Portsmouth finished building 32 submarines. It looked like about 1 submarine every 11 days. Most of the military submarines were below class, and they were built for an average of 12 months. From laying the keel to putting it into service at Portsmouth, it took several months less time than other yards to build the same grade. 74 submarines were made by an electric boat business in Groton, Connecticut. During the battle, even though it is on the Great Lakes, Mantarock Shipbuilding in Wisconsin built 28 submarines in lakes that were hundreds of miles from the ocean. They were then towed down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico. During World War II, the U.S. built 203 submarines in all yards. During World War II, Each submarine needed thousands of fittings that were stud-welded. Every screw saved a minute of work time. That number of minutes times thousands of 100 subs, the time saved, and the number of studs per submarine. Shockingly large amounts. But subs weren't the only thing that happened. The real space was on the surface. Ships and commercial boats. Liberty Ship Program, which is run by the Maritime, put into service and mostly built at Kaiser factories, 2,710. For the war, there were cargo ships. About 5,000 people were needed to build each Liberty ship. 8,000 stud-welded fittings for decking, cargo handling gear, gun mounts for defense, and ship fittings. The Victory ships are faster and more advanced design, and were made to the same standards. The amount of work that was done was nothing like this has ever happened before in human history. At the height of building the Liberty ship in 1943, 3 new ships were launched every day. That's 75 ships every month, or 900 ships a year. Ships every year. This was only possible thanks to big changes in the way buildings are built, like prefabrication, modular construction, specialized workers, specialized tools, and faster connection. Ways to stud welding was an important part of a bigger change that made shipbuilding more efficient. When scaffolding was taken away, workers were able to do other things. Assembling took less time because of how quickly it was done. The ships were made quickly, but they were strong enough to withstand storms in the North Atlantic. The enemy strikes. In the spring of 1943, the U.S. Navy had taken official. Take note of Nelson's effort. The Secretary of the Navy spoke on May 11, 1943. The Army Navy E Award for Excellence in Production was given to the Nelson Specialty Welding Equipment Corporation. In July 1942, the E Award was made to honor companies whose production outstanding work was done by facilities in making war weapons. Quality that stands out and quantity was what made the difference. Only about 5% of businesses that did. These awards were given for war work. The prize was a pennant for the plant and individual pins for each worker. A full military honor guard was present at the event at the San Leandro plant. Navy officers, Army representatives, and local government leaders were there. The building workers, Nelson's employees, who had put in long hours to meet output needs, were proud to get their pins. Ted Nelson took the pennants and gave a short speech while standing in front of his workers in his normal shop clothes. Do not do this to get praise or awards. This was what we had to do for our country. Every gun we make and every stud we make build helps keep our soldiers and sailors safe at home. That's all that. We need a prize. But the Navy wasn't done recognizing what Nelson had done. Plants that kept up. People who did really well for 6 months after getting the E Award were given an extra star on their pennant. In November 1943, the Nelson Company got its first star. The second star showed up in May 1944. By the end of the war, the Nelson Specialty Welding Equipment. The company had won 2 E Awards with stars, making it one of only a few companies to reach this level of honor. The sources clearly mentioned the 50 million man-hours that were saved in building for the Navy. 50 million hours of work. Take some time to think about that number. 50 million hours is pretty much 5,700 years. It would take 8 hours of work every day for one person. It would take more than 19,000 years to get 50 million hours. This time, because of one easy change, money was saved. A welding gun with a spring and a clay cap for flux. The extra time saved led straight to ships in the water more quickly. There are more subs looking for Japanese ships. Even more destroyers watching over convoys. There are more hits from aircraft carriers. One more landing. Marines are sent to enemy beaches by ships. Every ship that got there faster meant more supplies and fighting power delivered, and more lives were saved. The effect on strategy was impossible to measure. But Nelson's invention had another use that no one expected. It took less skill to do stud welding than standard ways of installing bolts or welding. New employees could do stud work with little training, doing welding jobs safely and correctly. This was very important as the war went on and workers became scarce. Gotten stronger. A record amount of women went into the shipyards. A well-known Rosie the Riveter was a sign of women who worked in shipyards, but there was also Wendy the Welder. Stu was run by women. Fixed equipment, used welding guns, and put down deck planking. Many became very good at the job. At its busiest, Mare Island Naval Shipyard hired nearly 50,000 jobs, with 9,000 women. Kaiser Shipyards hired a lot of people, and women make up almost 30% of the workforce. These women needed simple, safe tools and methods that they could learn quickly. Stud welding made that work exactly what was needed. It was clear that the war was over for good by 1944. The Allies. The United States industrial production was much higher than the Axis powers. The U.S. made more planes, ships, tanks, and guns than Germany and Japan put together. It was what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. It worked at full power. Ted Nelson's stud guns were not very big, a big part of this huge business success. But little things do matter. In war, how well something works is judged by how many lives it saves and how many fights it wins. Ship that moves faster. Building meant that more military power could be sent to battle sooner. More military power meant that more Japanese ships were sunk. By taking islands, you put more pressure on the enemy. The war with submarines in the Pacific shown this very clearly. They sank more than 1,000 American and Japanese subs. There are about 5 million tons of cargo ships. They sank 8 warships, an aircraft carrier, and 1 other ship. A lot of destroyers and battleships. This was only possible because the U.S. built subs faster than Japan could sink them. At the start of the war, Japan had more submarines than the U.S. During the war, Japan only made 126 subs, though. The U.S. built 203. Every 1 month of fast building was important. Every week a submarine joined the fleet. If it got there early, it added another week. Looking for enemy ships. The program for the Essex-class aircraft carrier looked a lot like patterns. In December, the U.S. Navy had 7 aircraft carriers. 1941, the Navy had 99 aircraft carriers by August 1945. Kinds. The Essex-class fleet carriers were the most important parts of this force. 24 were finished, and each one can hold up to 90 planes. It was the fast carrier task teams, built around Essex-class carriers, took over the Pacific from the middle of 1943 onward. Moving forward, the Japanese positions were shelled by these ships, and airstrikes were started. Covered amphibious landings from the air and fought decisive battles with Japanese naval troops. The fight. United States ship planes destroyed in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was an attack by over 600 Japanese planes. The United States only won this battle because it had more ships in the right place at the right time. Construction went faster, which led to faster release. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the D-Day invasion of Normandy began. Needed 7,000 boats and ships to land. This armada, which is the biggest coastal, only because American and British shipyards made so many landing craft, was the biggest attack in history possible. The landing ships were simple, flat-bottomed boats that were made to pull up to beaches and unload goods. However, needed to be built quickly and with trusted parts. It turned out to be perfect for building landing craft. It is possible to use cargo stairs, davit mounts, and deck fittings. Be put in place quickly and safely. Nelson's invention for attaching to a submarine deck was found. Uses across the whole fleet of landing boats. After May 8, 1945, V-Day, the Pacific became the center of attention. Operation, which was the planned attack of Japan. It was set to happen in November 1945. More ships would be needed for the task. More landing craft and more help with logistics than any other mission. Shipyards got ready for yet another rush of work. Then on August 6th and 9th, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed by atomic bombs in 1945. Japan gave up the fight. The end of World War II was on August 15, 1945. The huge factory that makes things for the military started to slow down. Contracts were thrown out. People lost their jobs. Shipyards shut down or switched to making things for quiet. The Nelson Corporation for Specialty Welding Equipment faced a future they didn't know. Almost overnight, there were no more military orders. At its best, the company had over 400 employees, but it was now at risk of going out of business. But Ted Nelson was ready. Right now, during the war, he thought about how plate welding could be used in times of peace. The technology wasn't just used to build ships. Any business that built steel structures could gain from quicker ways to connect building, construction, tanks, and pressure. vehicles, and ships. There were many options. Nelson switched to public markets. He sold his stud welding systems to steel fabricators, building companies, and makers in industry. The building boom after World War II opened up new possibilities. America was putting up roads, bridges, city halls, and suburbs. All steel manufacturing that was needed. Ties and bond. In 1948, Nelson's business had successfully switched to during times of peace. The business was not as big as it was during the war, but it was safe and growing. The company kept coming up with new ideas, like making better welding guns and new types of studs. For applications, he sold his business to TRW, a big industrial company, in 1950. Company Group. The sale secured Nelson's finances and let him stop working as an involved management, but the product still had the Nelson name on it. The company TRW kept advertising Nelson's stud welding tools, keeping up the reputation Nelson had built for his brand. Over the next few decades, the business changed, and a few times. In the year 2000, TRW sold to Farsantech Incorporated. In 2007, Doncaster's Group Limited bought Fintech. D.A. Stanley Black & purchased the industrial business in 2018. With all of these changes, the Nelson brand lived on. Today, Stanley Engineered makes fasteners and sells Nelson stud welding goods all over the world. Ted Nelson was the first person to use this device in his garage in Vallejo. Is still used all over the world. Nelson's original idea for stud welding is not as simple as it is today. Accurate arc control is possible with inverter power sources. Automatic systems take care of making a lot of things. In auto assembly plants, robotic welders use studs, but the basic idea is the same. Stays the same. A stud, a flux cap, a gun with a spring, and an electrical arc. Each stud takes 1 second. There's no need for scaffolding. The number of applications has grown. Besides building ships, to join metal pieces together, construction workers use stud welding. From decking to steel beams in tall buildings. It is used to make guardrail posts and light mounts for bridge builders. Power from nukes. It is used in plants to make cable trays and equipment supports. Automobile makers use it all over their vehicles. To connect the trim and ground, bodies are used. Nelson came up with this technology to solve a naval construction problem. Almost every industry that works with steel has found uses for this problem. But the most touching legacy of Nelson's invention is found in the restoration of historic ships. The battleship Texas, one of only 7 remaining ships to have served in both World Wars, is currently undergoing restoration at a dry dock facility. The ship requires extensive work to repair corroded hull plates and deteriorated fittings. The restoration team discovered that modern Nelson stud welding equipment is ideal for this work. They can attach new steel plates using the same technology Ted Nelson invented 80 years ago. Similarly, the submarine USS Pampanito, a World War II boat now preserved in San Francisco, uses Nelson stud welding for ongoing maintenance. The boat sits at the Embarcadero, hosting over 100,000 visitors annually. Keeping the old boat safe and functional requires constant attention. Theodore. Equipment allows the volunteer restoration crew to perform welding work efficiently without requiring certified welders for every task. Ted Nelson lived to see his invention's impact extend far beyond what he imagined that day in 1941 when he sketched his idea in a notebook. He saw stud welding become standard practice in shipbuilding. He saw it adopted by industries worldwide. He saw his name become synonymous with a welding process. He died in 1994 at the age of 89, having lived long enough to witness the end of the Cold War and the transformation of the world his generation had fought to preserve. The statistics of his achievement tell only part of the story. 50 million man-hours saved, 2 Army Navy E awards, thousands of ships built faster, billions of studs manufactured, but numbers cannot capture the full impact. Behind those statistics were sailors who returned home because their submarine was completed in time to join the fleet. Marines who survived because landing craft were available for their assault. Families who were not torn apart because the war ended sooner. The true measure of innovation is not just efficiency gained, but lives preserved. Ted Nelson, the $11 a day welder who was told his idea was impractical, saved more lives than many combat heroes. He did it not with weapons, but with welding, not through destruction, but through construction. The rejection he faced was not unique. History is filled with innovators dismissed by established authorities. Wilbur and Orville Wright were told powered flight was impossible by experts. Henry Ford was laughed at for suggesting automobiles could be mass-produced. Chester Carlson spent years trying to sell his xerography process before finding a buyer. What made Nelson different was his refusal to accept rejection. He did not argue with bureaucrats. He did not waste time trying to convince skeptics. He simply quit his job, risked his savings, and proved his concept worked. Then the market did the convincing for him. This is the essence of American innovation. Not waiting for permission, not following established procedures, not accepting that things must be done the way they have always been done. Just identifying a problem, developing a solution, and having the courage to implement it regardless of institutional resistance. Mare Island Naval Shipyard, where Nelson worked and where his idea was rejected, closed in 1996 after 142 years of service. Over its lifetime, the yard built 512 ships and repaired thousands more. The yard was responsible for construction of 44 submarines, including the last nuclear submarine built in California, USS Drum, launched in 1970. The base was declared a California Historical Landmark in 1960, and parts were designated a National Historic Landmark District in 1975. Today, the former shipyard is being redeveloped as a commercial and residential area. Some of the historic buildings remain, including the chapel, dry docks, and industrial structures. Walking through these preserved spaces, visitors can imagine the frantic activity of the war years when tens of thousands of workers built submarines around the clock. In Building 46, the old pipe shop that operated until 1984, there is now a small museum. Among the exhibits are tools, photographs, and artifacts from the shipyard's history. There is no specific exhibit about Ted Nelson. No monument to the welder who saved 50 million man-hour. His story is largely forgotten except among welding professionals and maritime historians. This anonymity would probably not have bothered Nelson. He was not seeking fame or recognition. He was solving a problem. He was making things work better. He was doing his part to help his country win a war. The fact that his solution worked, that it saved time and lives, that it changed an industry, those were reward enough. But there is a lesson here for every generation. Innovation often comes from unexpected places, not from credentialed experts, but from working people who see problems every day and know how to fix them. Not from corporate research labs, but from garage workshops where tinkerers experiment until they find solutions. Not from official channels, but from individuals willing to risk everything on an idea they know is right. The next great innovation might come from a welder in a shipyard, a mechanic in a garage, a nurse in a hospital, a teacher in a classroom. It might come from someone official channels dismiss as unqualified, someone bureaucrats tell to follow procedures, someone experts assure is wasting time on an impossible problem. History suggests we should listen to these people, not because all their ideas will work, but because the occasional idea that does work can change everything. Ted Nelson's ceramic flux cap was just a small piece of ceramic. His welding gun was just a simple spring-loaded tool, but combined they eliminated scaffolding, saved time, increased safety, improved quality, and accelerated ship production at a critical moment in history. 50 million man-hours, 5,700 years. That is what one welder's rejected idea ultimately saved. And that number represents only the direct construction time savings. It does not account for the strategic impact of faster ship deployment. It does not measure the lives saved because submarines reached the Pacific sooner. It does not calculate the morale boost from seeing production goals exceeded. It does not quantify the deterrent effect of American naval power growing faster than enemies anticipated. The full impact of Ted Nelson's invention may never be fully calculated, but we can say with certainty that America's victory in World War II depended on industrial capacity as much as military valor. The battles were won by soldiers, sailors, and Marines, but the war was won by workers, engineers, and innovators. People like Ted Nelson who saw a problem and fixed it. who refused to accept inefficiency when efficiency was possible, who understood that in total war, every minute saved in production translated to lives saved in combat. As we face the challenges of the 21st century, this lesson remains relevant. The problems we confront, climate change, resource scarcity, infrastructure decay, require innovation. At every level, solutions will come not just from elite universities and corporate laboratories, but from working people who see problems clearly and develop practical fixes. The next Ted Nelson might be designing a better solar panel in a garage workshop. The next breakthrough might come from a factory worker who knows exactly what is wasting time and energy. The next revolution in efficiency might originate with someone official channels have already dismissed as unqualified. We need to listen. We need to encourage innovation from all sources. We need to reduce the barriers between problem identification and solution implementation. We need to remember that some of the most important innovations in history came from people working outside the system because the system refused to listen. Ted Nelson started as a $11 a day welder. He ended as a millionaire industrialist whose technology saved his country. But he never forgot his roots. He never put on airs. He never claimed to be anything more than a mechanic who saw a problem and fixed it. In his later years, when asked about his success, he would shrug and say, "I just made a better mousetrap. The world beat a path to my door." It was not genius. It was just common sense. But common sense applied at the right moment with courage and persistence can change history. That is Ted Nelson's legacy. Not the 50 million hours saved. Not the WWII awards. Not the global company that still bears his name. His legacy is the proof that one person with a good idea and the determination to implement it can make a difference. That legacy lives on every time a welder pulls the trigger on a stud welding gun. Every time a ship is built faster than the old methods allowed. Every time someone looks at an inefficient process and asks, "There has to be a better way." Ted Nelson asked that question in 1941. His answer helped win a war. What questions are you asking today? And more importantly, when the experts tell you it cannot be done, when the bureaucrats tell you to follow procedures, when the skeptics dismiss your idea, will you have the courage to prove them wrong? The history of innovation suggests that sometimes the most important thing you can do is ignore the experts. Trust your own observations and build the solution you know will work. Ted Nelson did exactly that. 80 years later, welders around the world still use his invention every single day. And somewhere, perhaps in a garage or workshop, the next Ted Nelson is sketching an idea that everyone says will not work. However, we'll be wrong because the best innovations do not come from following procedures. They come from people who see a problem, know how to fix it, and refuse to take no for it.